little bit international, a little bit more international before I come back to the region. Carlos, I want to jump over to Dr. Shah, who is director for the Islands Policy Lab. He's talking about resources. We're talking about how we can support the countries in ways that are impactful. There's a view among some entities that sometimes the contributions are peripheral and not necessarily as impactful. So the question for you, Director, is what role should international agencies play in supporting development of enabling environments to accelerate the energy transition? And in the context of the IPL, how can IPL add value to Caribbean energy transition? What are the benefits? What are the specific things that they can look forward to in terms of helping their transition? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chair. Just let me say, it's a pleasure to be here on this panel and with you as one of the IRENA's academic members. I'm so very happy to sort of be here in this, I'll call us a triple helix, right, of government, business, and academia, right? That sounds appropriate. So in this triple helix panel, I think what we're talking about here, and a lot of what I'll talk about is sort of rationalizes and summarizes a lot of the things that my colleagues have said. And we're all talking about country transition readiness in a sense, right? Country level transition readiness and regional transition readiness, and the enabling conditions that we need here in the region to do that. An interesting starting point should always be the fact that small island states, if small island states have had a starting point of trying to use templates of Western administrative bureaucracies to build regulatory frameworks, then you've started off on the wrong foot. And in many respects, much of what we've said here ends up being corrections to those starting points. But that being said, we are where we are. And in the enabling conditions discussion, we talk about regulations, institutions, governance frameworks, human capital and capacity. And a lot of what's been said, my colleague here also said a lot about how do we induce future conducive business environments, right? And I think another foundation point has to be that, and it was said already in many ways, that enabling conditions, we all speak about enabling conditions from our different perspectives, private sector, government, international institutions, and sometimes we speak in different dialects, right? Different lenses, talking about literally the same governance systems, but we mean different things. And what I mean by that is, if you ask what governments want the public good, right? They want development that accrues to the public good. Good social conditions, environmental conditions, economic progress. Now that's a little bit different from a private investor's perspective, obviously, right? And private investors want all these things too, but you know what they're very interested in is what's that value proposition? High benefits, low risks, right? And we had the discussion this morning about de-risking. So that's what private investors want. Now, on the government side, public good, we talk about what we've traditionally talked about in the region, energy security, our bread and butter, all right? Devon mentioned the 2012 regional energy policy, very much built along the premises of traditional energy security, affordability, stability, reliability of energy supplies. We're moving now into resilient systems. So climate resilient, but also resilient to new threats of cybersecurity and so on. I think I'm not sure even if the region how much the region is grappling with that right now, but that's sort of not even on the horizon, right? It's here. And then, of course, how we leverage all these conditions for economic prosperity. And then on the, so how do we develop enabling conditions from the government side to address those things? And the private sector wants to address those things as well, those enabling conditions, but towards, how do we get the right incentives to move projects forward? What if proper form and structure of incentives? We spoke about this morning, even things like government guarantees and so on. How do we structure those incentives for the private sector? There's also a need for stable, fair, reliable legal systems, regulatory systems that make an even playing field. And this again is very heterogeneous across the region, right? And that point was made. Legal frameworks remain heterogeneous across the system. And it's very difficult for investors to look at that situation and just shake their heads. This is very difficult. Information and data. Devon mentioned the term intelligence. I think that's pretty important for developers as well. And I think this is another role that international institutions can play in helping us develop that intelligence. We need information and data parity in a competitive environment, and that benefits investors. And then scale. Scale is sort of like the elephant in the room. Almost everyone's spoken about scale in different ways. And again, going back to even sort of the question of aggregating that came up this morning. Aggregating projects, aggregating investments, that could be regional. It could also be vertical or horizontal integration, depending on what investors want. And moving a policy framework forward from a regional policy framework forward from 2012, based heavily on energy security principles, to a framework that works now, obviously means the upgraded, modernized policy that's being worked on includes resilience, climate resilience principles, and also the just transition principles in there as well. So to the question that the chair mentioned, and I'll go very quickly, right? So what do we want? What do we want as a region from our international partners, right? And yeah, partners, but it has to be what we want, right? I don't think anyone can disagree with that, right? Hopefully by this day and age, that's not a controversial statement. But there are a couple things. So we have to look at it in sort of in this ecosystem of international partners that we have. Who, what, and why do we leverage on the public good side, public sector capacity building? Lots of good ideas there. There was an idea of pool procurement, for example. I think that's a wonderful one to look into. Then on the private sector side, how do our international partners play a role in encouraging the right kinds of structured investments and encouraging the enthusiasm of the investment class to invest in the region? But then sort of the more important and the more interesting pieces would be on that public-private interface. And I think Mr. Williams spoke about public-private partnerships earlier. And that seems to be a more interesting piece, a more lucrative piece where the international partners can help us, right? Now I think there's two pieces of the puzzle when we talk about public-private interface on clean energy projects. And one is where we have good alignment of the enabling conditions between what the public good is and what private investors want. Where there's good alignment of enabling conditions, we see that manifested quite obviously. We have projects that get off the ground pretty fast. We have projects grow. We have projects replicated, right? We have more investors coming in. So we kind of have sort of an exogenous kind of manifestation when we do have the right enabling environments. In that kind of situation, the role of the international actors would be to help us to scale those up, replicate those, figure out why they work, and expand them, okay? Now, the other piece of the public-private interface is the misalignments, where enabling conditions misalign between government's public good objective and the private sector's return on investment objectives. And again, if we can find, and there's manifestations of that. Lagging projects, not enough investors, investor lack of enthusiasm, and it becomes obvious. So again, here I think is where, in these cases of misalignments, international institutions can help to negotiate and navigate those waters to make those alignments in the enabling conditions. I think the last point I'll make is, I think international partners also have this sort of bird's eye view to help us in the region. We don't work in a vacuum, obviously, we know this, all right? But there's an interesting example that Minister said this morning about Barbados and having to wait for 18 months for energy storage batteries, all right? I think if we leverage international partners who understand or have experience working in the global environment with supply chains and other different kinds of operating contexts, we can get that intelligence to us to make sure those kinds of situations are minimized in the future, right? So I think we do need to leverage international institutions in that way. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. Carlos, I'm going to come to you, and you're a little bit at a disadvantage because many of the points that I had in mind have been raised somewhat. But let me just go back to that point about how can a country access some of that resource. And maybe it would be useful if you could just tell us, not Carlos now, but I just want to go back to Dr. Shah just a bit. Just a quick word about the lab, because I'm not sure if I picked up specifically your remit, mandate, scope. Just a quick word on that. And then how can any of the countries here access some of what you're talking about there? I mean, there's an intervention. They recognize that they need some help. How difficult, how easy, how can they go about that? Can you just speak to those two things quickly?
So very quickly, yes, the Island Policy Lab, so we work as a boundary organization within academia, and I mentioned the triple helix, which I think is really important. And congrats, IRENA on having us here as well, and I know there are other colleagues from UWI and so on here. So I think that's really critical. Now the Island Policy Lab is set up sort of as a policy lab specifically, which means that we're not a center or institution. We're very much set up to be more agile and nimble and sort of responding to country needs and needs of the international development community. Research to development is what we call that. And pretty much we have a lot of good, Devon will tell you, we have a lot of good scientific assessments and technical studies going on in the region. But a lot of that remains unfiltered or less utilized or not maximized in the policy solution generation field. So we're specifically set up as a space that will help countries and institutions to do that. Crunch all those fantastic, lovely technical studies that we love to do here in the region into some concrete policy solutions that decision makers can utilize, just laying out options. So the kinds of things that we try to do on a policy scale, so in a science lab, typically you do experiments, right? Well, we do policy experiments. We'll do policy experiments, we'll use your data, your assessments, and we'll use your experience knowledge, right, to help you look at models, optimization models, experiments, to see how things might pan out before you actually do that. Of course, if you're in government, you can't do experiments, right, with taxpayer money. So we can help you do those kinds of things.
Thank you so much.